So, about a month ago, we released our most recent Bleach battle analysis on the channel, where we took a look at the fight between Kenpachi Zaraki and Yachiru Unohana. And now it's time for the promised follow-up to that video, Zaraki's next battle in the Thousand-Year Blood War arc, where he takes on the supposed strongest Sternritter v the visionary Gremmy THOUMEAUX. And this is, of course, a pretty major fight for Zaraki. I would argue potentially his most consequential of the entire final arc, where he finally gets a chance to reveal the fruits of his training, his Zanpakuto's name, and the much-anticipated Shikai that comes along with it. Before we get started with the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, as well as it does help support me and the channel, as it just means hopefully the videos get more exposure on the YouTube algorithm. And if you do like what I do here, if you enjoy the content I output on the channel, I have a Patreon for my channel as well. Now, you don't have to support me over there, of course, but if you decided to, you can get videos like this one early, and you can support me over there for as little as $1 a month. Everyone who's supporting me on Patreon, who's a patron of this channel, is coming up on screen right now, so as we do every video, I just want to give them a massive shout out for helping me do what I love here. Thank you guys so very much. So, Zaraki's fights throughout the Thousand-Year Blood War arc follow a through line of development for this character, and he has a really interesting subplot in this arc. He gets an awful lot of exposure, but I think it comes together really nicely in a way that really pushes the character forwards in ways I probably wasn't expecting to happen. He gets both his Shikai and his Bankai in this arc, both things that I think long-standing fans of the series never expected to see. But on the flip side, I'm happy that we did, and I think they introduced a brand new dynamic, a whole new layer to this character. And like I said a minute ago, I think this fight of all of them for Zaraki is perhaps the most consequential. It's also quite long, ranging from chapter 572 through to 579, and that is with no gaps whatsoever. This is what we like on this channel, an unbroken, fluid fight, and I do really appreciate that. And so the fight is about 7 chapters long, which by just Bleach standards in general is pretty lengthy for a fight completely unbroken. Certainly for the Thousand-Year Blood War arc, where I would say the average length for a fight is about 4 chapters, this one stands out. Certainly the fights a little bit later on are longer than this, but this is a big one, and this was certainly a pinnacle battle in kind of the midpoint of the arc. And we know an awful lot about Kenpachi Zaraki at this point in the story, but what about his opponent, the mysterious Gremmy? Gremmy is a really weird character. He's like an enigma, a void of a character in my opinion. And I've mentioned this before, but Gremmy kind of exists in a vacuum to me. And in some ways, his character, his portrayal, his role in the story is very emblematic of a lot of the issues that people had with the Vandenreich and the Sternritter in general, in that he just kind of exists for the purpose of this fight, to fight and die by Kenpachi's revealed Shikai, even though that's not even what happens in the end, which makes the whole thing even stranger to me. But basically it does feel like Gremmy is here to exist as a vessel to eventually reveal Kenpachi's Shikai. And, you know, compare and contrast this to another major villain that Kenpachi takes on, Neutra. Neutra exists plenty before his eventual battle with Kenpachi. He's at the Espada meeting, talks briefly with Ulquiorra, has a fight with Ichigo, takes down Chad, and only then does he finally fight and die against Zaraki. Gremmy literally appears for this fight in chapter 572 and dies in 579, having never been mentioned prior to this, and is pretty much, I don't think, ever mentioned again, which is why I say he exists in a strange vacuum-like space. When you look at all the volumes of Bleach, Gremmy lives and dies exclusively in volume 64. He even gets the cover for that one. And it's just such a weird phenomenon to me. It's probably a much smaller deal than I think it is, but it's so strange to me that... And, you know, you do get characters who live and die in just a few chapters. For example, Nyanzol Wyzol. The reason it sticks out so much with Gremmy, though, in my opinion, is that he is the conduit for a major battle. This fight is one of the biggest in the arc. And Kenpachi revealing his Shikai is a huge deal. And so it's just weird to me that the person who is instrumental in that is never heard of or seen of prior to this or after this again. And I think that's just kind of weird, but it is what it is. But speaking of Zaraki, and when I mentioned that undercurrent of his development, he has got interesting development in this fight, and it really feels like he's come away from that pivotal battle against Unohana having learnt something, having changed as a man and as a character. He seems to be shouldering extra weight now, and you kind of see that in his first appearance in this fight, and unfortunately, I think he loses some of that development moving on from this battle. I'm not entirely sure what Kubo was going for with that, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So basically a small piece of introductory context, Yachiru and Isane are taking on Gwenael Lee, who is revealed to be a figment of the imagination of the real Sternritter they need to fight, Gremmy, who, like I said, kind of appears out of nowhere, announces that he has killed Rose and Kensei, and then takes on Yachiru, very quickly defeating her by revealing that his ability allows him to literally turn imagination into reality. Clearly one of the most overpowered and potentially broken powers we have ever seen before. Yachiru is struggling, and suddenly the wall behind them just explodes, and Zaraki arrives on the scene. The first time we have seen him in the manga since 527, I want to say, so it's been about 5 volumes, so his return is welcome, and I remember people were very excited to see him, because we expected good things after the last time we saw him. The very last thing that happened was his Zanpakuto began to speak to him, so people were very hyped by Zaraki's arrival here. And I have to say, I absolutely love Kenpachi's introduction into this fight. It's somber, it's bleak, it's very, very cinematic, and just totally unlike normal, traditional Zaraki entrances, which is normally him cutting off a limb, firing off some kind of wisecrack, and it's, generally kind of corny but typical Zaraki entrances. This is not like that at all, and it goes back to that idea I mentioned earlier of him carrying extra weight going into this fight. He's dragging the baggage of his battle with Unohana. Unohana's death is like a ball and chain rattling around his ankle. And so fittingly it starts with a moment with Isane, which is wonderfully done, where basically she says, Zaraki, she gets straight to it. She's like, where is Captain Unohana? And he just says, she's dead. And then Isane collapses to the ground. You get the sense that despair is washing over her, but then it suddenly turns on a dime and you realise, actually, maybe she's relieved, which I think is a really cool character turn. It seems like Isane, either she knew the truth about Unohana or she took it from the letter that Unohana left her, but either way, she seems to understand the significance of Unohana's death in these circumstances. As she starts to tear up and she says, oh, if you cut her down, then that means that you've inherited it, Unohana's name. And, she feels seemingly so happy about this. There is that sense of relief washing over Isane where she's like, Unohana can pass on in peace. And Zaraki's like, yeah, I have. And he says very little here. You only see the sort of backside of his face. Very, very cinematic. Kubo's so good at this thing, using very few words, but getting across everything you need. These panels look so good, and I love how ominous the whole thing is. And that's what I mean by this feels so different to a normal Zaraki fight. But Gremmy doesn't plan on waiting around too long. Clearly he's read up on the daton provided by Yhwach because he knows exactly who this is he's coming up against. He knows that Kenpachi Zaraki has something of a reputation, probably aided by the fact he single-handedly killed 3 Sternritter in the first invasion, but Gremmy creates a massive, grandiose stage for the two of them to fight on, creating an enormous stone platform that bursts up out of the ground and, just makes this a real spectacle for everyone, even though no one else can see what's going on because it's way too high, but that's neither here nor there. And this first chapter of their actual fight is pretty simplistic. It's really just setting, literally, the stage for the fight to come. Gremmy says, I figured you'd probably like to fight me because I think I'm the strongest of all the Sternritter. And Kenpachi kind of says, oh, right, is that the case? And he just basically brings down his sword. I'm kind of assuming he was going to kill Gremmy in one hit. He's rather surprised to see that Gremmy has completely stopped his blade, seemingly by doing absolutely nothing. The sword has just landed with a thud on Gremmy's chest, and Gremmy's like, look, I told you, I can imagine anything into reality, your sword can't cut me. Kenpachi, however, always one for subverting expectations, simply kind of just brute forces his way through and slices Gremmy's shoulder. And Kenpachi says, and I thought I told you, there's nothing I can't cut, because I am the Kenpachi. And the way this chapter ends, you know, the shadows on his face, this is what I was talking about when I said he has seemingly brought with him some character development from his fight with Unohana. He seems to have changed now that he actually officially bears the title of Kenpachi, because up until now he technically wasn't the Kenpachi. He seems to have accepted the weight that comes with that, the burden of responsibility of being the so-called strongest Shinigami. Now that he's actually taken that title from Unohana, he seems to be ready to take things a little bit more seriously, perhaps, take his role as that greatest fighter of Soul Society a little bit more in his stride. And I was really excited about that. I thought that maybe long gone were the days of Zaraki simply rushing into a fight and getting instantly hit, or trying his best to just kind of cut away at someone without a second thought, but we'll get into that a little bit later, because although that does seem to be the case in this fight, it seems like he's kind of left that behind. Like I said, Kubo regresses a little bit when we get into the fights in Varvel, which I thought was a little disappointing. But this first fight establishes a precedent that Kenpachi seems ready to take this fight seriously now that he has the title of Kenpachi officially. And honestly, I said this fight might be Kenpachi's most consequential of the arc. I also think it's easily his weirdest fight of the series to date. Because up until now, Kenpachi is normally squarely placed against melee fighters. And this is the first time that hasn't really happened. Gremmy is nothing like the typical opponent Kenpachi normally fights, and I think that was clearly done on purpose to add a bit of variety into his battle repertoire. But I think it's really cool seeing him adapt to the way this fight plays out as well. And I do actually enjoy this fight a fair bit. I think it's certainly one of the strangest battles in the Thousand Year Blood War, just in general. There's a real weirdness to this fight. And I think some of that, there's a lot of factors at play here that make it such a strange battle. This is one of them, the fact that Kenpachi doesn't normally fight people like this at all. And one small thing that the Thousand Year Blood War arc does really, really well, in my opinion, is give everything a sense of a wider scope. And it does that a lot of the time by including normal officers, normal Shinigami. You know, if you look back at the Fate Karakura Town, it's literally just a fight of the elite. Captains, vice-captains, and the occasional special seated officer like Ikaku or Yubichika. There's just not a normal Shinigami in sight for basically that entire arc. The Thousand Year Blood War arc totally gets rid of that, and I love it for that. I think it feels way more like a war when all of Soul Society is involved. And so it's really cool seeing regular run-of-the-mill Shinigami getting their morale boosted when they sense that Zaraki has arrived on the scene to take out one of these powerful enemies for them. You get this a little bit earlier as well with Hitsugaya and Rangiku fighting Bazby. It's just really cool, and it gives it a greater sense of being a war, and I really appreciate that. There is also a bit of light foreshadowing here as well, when the officers say that if Zaraki's been here this whole time, how comes we've only just sensed his Reiatsu, hinting that he's no longer just leaking it like mad because he's actually gotten control of himself and his Zanpakuto, crucially. Now, one thing I do like a lot about this fight is the visuals, as you might expect from a battle, including someone who can literally imagine things into existence. There are some really cool effects happening in this fight. Some people would argue Kubo didn't go far enough, and I remember when this fight was coming out weekly, people were roundly criticising Kubo for basically not being creative enough with Gremmy's abilities, because this guy can literally create anything. Why are we just seeing lava, water, stone statues? But I don't know, I kind of think, like, when you take a step back and you look a bit deeper at Gremmy's character, which we'll get into, it kind of makes sense that he's not going completely mad, and actually it escalates as the fight goes on in line with Gremmy's personality and how he is feeling out this fight. But it does begin with basically him summoning a torrent of lava, like the platform they're on erupts almost, sending this plume of flaming, boiling hot magma straight into the sky. Really cool, again, just awesome visuals. Kenpachi slices through it with his blade, almost killing Yachiru. The flaming lava lands near her, and he's like, "Get out of here, what are you doing?" Only realizing then that she actually can't move because Gremmy has turned her bones into cookies, which seemingly to me, I think that would probably kill her outright, but apparently not. But basically, Kenpachi's like, why didn't you just tell me that to begin with? We're trying to have a fight here. It's annoying me that you're being so coy about basically what you can do. Kenpachi, being very much a straight man, likes things to be laid out pretty much on the table when a fight begins. Zaraki leaps at Gremmy, only for Gremmy to encase him in a massive cube of water in the air, bringing it crashing down onto the platform. Basically, Gremmy opens a massive sort of chasm within the platform itself. Kenpachi and the water falls within it. He closes it shut and basically plans on having Kenpachi drown in this crevice. Of course, it's not going to be ever that easy when Zaraki is involved. He bursts out of the top of the platform almost immediately. One of the pieces of debris goes spiraling towards Gremmy. Gremmy uses his imagination to make it disappear before it can hit him, only to be confronted by Zaraki leaping out of the rubble, carrying Yachiru in one hand, and basically being like, that's never going to be enough to take me down. Now, that makes sense to me. I'm not entirely sure how Yachiru can survive being crushed in this rock crevice when it actually closes in on them, but, maybe it's to do with her true nature of being a Zanpakuto spirit, perhaps. But Kenpachi tries to attack Gremmy only to be blocked by something at the last second, but he reveals a crucial weakness to Gremmy's the Visionary, being the moment Kenpachi picked Yachiru up, her bones seemed to have returned to normal. So it seems like if Gremmy kind of loses focus or stops focusing on something that he's trying to imagine, it will return to its previous state, which I think is really interesting. It actually says a lot about Gremmy too, the life he has to live in order to maintain some kind of status quo, which again we'll get into in a minute. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but there is a wonderful scene of Askin watching the fight with Gremmy and Kenpachi, basically commenting on how Kenpachi must be amazing to actually be able to fight alongside Gremmy, because of course Askin comes from a privileged position of knowing Gremmy more than the audience. He's spent presumably a lot of time with Gremmy in the past. We know that Gremmy is kept locked in a cage beneath Silburn for basically his entire life. And I just wish we'd actually seen some of this. There's a wonderful opportunity in chapter 543, for example, when we first get to really see the Sternritter, to just have a glimpse of someone locked in a cage far below everyone else. That would have been such a great tease, and we would have been like, what can this guy do? What's he done to be down there? Instead, we simply have to be told about it, and of course it's that whole idea of show, don't tell, and you kind of get the impression that maybe Gremmy was a slightly later stage addition to the repertoire of the villains than some of the other characters, but that's a bit of a shame. But basically, Askin and Pepe just exist here to hype both each other up, but also, crucially, Gremmy up for this fight ahead. Askin has a lovely little speech about how, we always want people to be able to achieve their dreams, but when you see someone who can literally achieve his dreams, you realise maybe it's a good thing that not everyone can. And it's just really cool. It's Askin again being quite savvy, both of them deciding that maybe we shouldn't be quite so close to the fight because no doubt it's going to go south very quickly. And just basically foreshadowing that Gremmy is going to cause some city-wide problems a bit later on. Now, for me, this is where the fight gets really interesting. Now that Yachiru's bones are back to normal, she leaves the arena, and it's just the two combatants involved. And Kenpachi is not used to this at all, and I think that's what makes things so cool here, so intriguing to read. Basically, he's put in a situation that he's just not used to. He's up against someone who is quite obviously very powerful, very reasonably strong, but it seems like Gremmy's got no idea what he's doing. He has no idea how to fight somebody. He has no idea why he should be fighting someone. And Zaraki, who is the total opposite of that, Zaraki is very powerful and loves a fight, loves a good fight. He's always down for making it as fair as possible, dragging it out as long as possible and just getting all bloodied and beaten up and having a grand old time. You have Gremmy on the other side, whose hands are always in his pockets. He clearly has never really dirtied his hands in his entire life. And that seems to be down to his own choices as much as being locked in a cage. But it's just really cool to see these totally two different diverging points of view on what it means to be the strongest. For Kenpachi, it's that idea of leveraging that to constantly have fun, to constantly be challenged, always be looking for that next person who can possibly take that title away from you. For Gremmy, it's not like that at all. It's being far above everyone else and never having to bring yourself down to their level. There's an unusual amount of introspection where Gremmy is concerned, certainly compared to the rest of the Sternritter, and we find out that he's always kind of known that he's the strongest. An ability like that, of course, he's basically way more powerful than every other Sternritter, but because of that, he's never felt a need to prove it. He's never felt a need to just kill someone outright to prove that he's the greatest of them all, because he knows it, and as far as he's concerned, everyone else knows it as well. And so you get these two totally different perspectives on what it means to be the respective strongest in that faction. I think that's so cool. Zaraki always seeking a new, greater challenge. Gremmy sort of shying away from it all because he feels it's all totally beneath him. And of course that has prepared one of them far better than the other for a big fight like this. And in my opinion, this is where Kenpachi really takes on the mantle of Kenpachi. You feel like he's tutoring Gremmy as the fight progresses, which is so cool. We're a far cry away here from the ever so slightly more immature and just battle-hungry Zaraki from arcs past. This one has, again, like I said, taken on a deeper meaning for the fact that he has killed Unohana, and now he's like teaching somebody else what it means to be in a fight, what it means to be in a battle. Like, Zaraki's literally like, what do you want? What do you want from me? Like, why am I here? Are we gonna fight properly? Like, how can you call yourself the strongest if you don't want to face off against somebody who else calls themselves the strongest? So I think that's awesome character work for Zaraki, and it's just really cool seeing him in a different light. Gremmy's ability also begs the question, however, why did Yhwach give him such a powerful shrift if he was just going to keep him locked up in a cage forevermore? Now, of course, the obvious answer to this is that Gremmy is like Gerard and Pernida in that he already had his powers prior to being given a shrift. Where the miracle and the compulsory are concerned, those shrifts are just totally nominal. They don't do anything, it's just a way of kind of creating consistency among the Sternritters, but where the rest of them were given their powers via their shrifts, Pernida and Gerard already had them because they are direct descendants, pieces of the Soul King. Can't Fear Your Own World, which we'll get into a little bit later, does seem to directly imply that Gremmy is a piece of the Soul King as well, so it's likely maybe then that he had his powers prior to getting the shrift, which makes more sense to me. But after his little pep talk with Kenpachi, Gremmy is beginning to change. His outlook on the fight is starting to differ, and he's realising that as the fight progresses, he actually wants to kill Kenpachi. He's starting to feel elation, he's starting to feel excited. And I think this is the whole idea of this fight, I think, is supposed to be Gremmy kind of coming out of his shell. I mentioned earlier that this character feels like a bit of an enigma, and I think that's supposed to come across in his design. You know, you can't really see any part of him. His body is completely concealed for the most part. He has an enormous hood, he has this rather large kind of almost like, well, it's like the base of his hood essentially, but it covers almost the entirety of his face, exposing really only his eyes. His hands are in his pockets almost all the time. And you're supposed to, he's meant to be this very weird, insular character. I actually really do like his design, but the fight is supposed to be him really coming out of his shell. At the start of the battle, you know, he mentions that I will basically defeat you without lifting a single finger. Later on, he starts using his hands briefly. You see more of his face, you see more of his expressions. His expressions go from being kind of just almost coldly vacant to starting to come alive, almost looking a bit wicked as the fight really progresses. I think that's really cool because it's like character development in real time, which I think is interesting. Kubo obviously realised, I think, that he had very limited time to use Gremmy, and it's cool to see the way that he plays with this character over the course of 7 chapters to make him almost a different person to the one we see in 572, by the time the fight is coming to its conclusion. So I think that's honestly pretty neat. But having decided he wants to kill Zaraki, he summons basically a massive bunch of guns which just fire rapidly, hitting Kenpachi before transforming into missile launchers, firing missiles at him, which again create another massive explosion. Again, this sort of thing is really cool because this is where, in my opinion at least, Gremmy's power was really starting to come into its own. Kubo was able to draw things that you normally wouldn't see in Bleach, and so I thought that was really neat. But Zaraki carves one of the missiles in half. Again, another really cool image, and it creates a massive explosion. Zaraki looks demonic in the smoke, which is just such a cool visual. And he basically says, that's the face. Now you're starting to get it. And, you know, the fight's starting to heat up. He's like, you're starting to get it. And now I think finally this guy can have a good fight as well, holding up his Zanpakuto toe. The first real tease that we are going to get to see Kenpachi's Shikai. And this is handled in a very similar way to the way Aizen's reveal is handled a little bit later on. Basically, Kubo kind of dragging it out a little bit, saving the cliffhangers of each chapter for the next big stage of the reveal. Which, I don't know, I think works pretty well for building up the excitement. Gremmy then summons a massive dome which he shields himself with. Blades come shooting out the side of it. Kenpachi sort of bats it away, smashes the dome to pieces, and brings his blade down upon Gremmy. Gremmy, however, like I said, is getting into this fight now. He's actually starting to enjoy himself, and I think he's starting to understand what it means to want to challenge yourself. There is, of course, the argument that Gremmy surely could just vanish Zaraki with a thought. Surely, if he can create life like he does with Gwenael and even himself later on, he can take life just as easily. And we see with Gwenael, he just kills him like that by thinking about it. So I think it's reasonable as the reader to be like, well, why isn't Gremmy just imagining Zaraki dead? And I think for that, you have to look into his mindset to understand why he hasn't done that yet. Because Zaraki is teaching him what it means to be the strongest, making him understand that, you know, you can show off your power. There are people out there who could challenge you if you wanted it, and that is what Gremmy wants, and it's what he's getting. So that's why he doesn't just get rid of Zaraki immediately, because this is a chance for him to really indulge himself, and you see that with the way his face is changing. He tricks Zaraki into slicing him easily, now lodging his blade into his body and making it so Zaraki can't escape. There's a wicked smile on his bloodied face as Zaraki realizes he's been caught, and this huge stone hand comes out of the sky and pummels Zaraki into the ground. And Gremmy even starts mimicking Zaraki at this point. He's like, you know, I told you it was pointless to try and slice me, but Zaraki bursts out of the stone arm. This is where things start to go a bit badly for Gremmy, and again, I think this is another interesting facet of this fight. As Kenpachi escapes the arm, he slices up Gremmy's chest. It's pretty brutal looking as well, and this is where I think, really, their experience the experience gap between them starts to be showcased better than ever. Because basically Kenpachi realizes that although Gremmy can seemingly heal his own wounds, as we've seen him do a couple of times just by imagining that they're gone, Kenpachi realizes that it takes Gremmy a fraction of a second too long to realize he's been injured and then heal it, and in that time, Zaraki can cut him and again and again. So basically, Zaraki gets him in a loop where Gremmy can't act fast enough. And you get this, like, kind of brutal moment, basically, where Zaraki slices Gremmy, then again, and blood just, like, is coming out of this guy. Blood is, like, shooting out of Gremmy. And you see him, like, staggering backwards, and in his head, he's like, I'm going to lose. He's like, I'm going to lose this. I can't stop Zaraki. He's too fast. Why can't I stop him? I'm trying to heal myself. As soon as I've done it, I've been hit again. And then Zaraki just stops his attacks. And he's like, what are you doing? And again, I like this. It's this Zaraki feels very different to me in this fight. Maybe he's not, and I'm just overthinking it. But I love the way he acts in this battle. As I said before, Zaraki is all about fairness. You know, he wants a challenge. He doesn't want an easy fight. That's why he thought Giriko was going to be boring, and he proved he was. He wants someone who can push him as far as he can go. That's why he used to wear the bells, the eye patch, and crucially, the eye patch never comes off in this fight either, which is kind of, again, showing you that Zaraki's maybe even going easy on this guy a lot of the time, but because he's trying to get him to come out of his shell, you know, and actually fight me properly. And so Zaraki's like, what are you doing? And Gremmy's like, covered in blood, like, what are you talking about? And Zaraki's like, you're not moving. Did you just imagine that you were going to lose? Obviously, that puts Gremmy in a really precarious position, because if he imagines it, it comes true. And I think, again, that's a really fascinating insight into how Gremmy has to live his life every single day. So Gremmy removes his wounds entirely, thanks Zaraki for kind of putting him back on track, but says that he will regret that because now he can't be killed. He basically says, I'm going to make it so that you can't kill me no matter the circumstance. You're really going to regret that. He then creates life again, this time creating literally a second version of himself. And, you get the impression that Zaraki still hasn't quite got what Gremmy's ability is, because he's like, oh, you've created a clone. What are you, a member of the covert ops? And Gremmy's like, no, this is me. It's a second me. I can create life completely. And he says that thanks to his power of imagination doubling, we'll get into that in a sec, he's now been able to summon a meteorite to basically obliterate the entirety of Soul Society. And this huge meteor appears in the sky, parting the clouds above them. The idea of doubling his imagination is a bit silly. Trying to quantify something like imagination means that you are putting limitations on something that is inherently limitless, and therefore it's weird. You can't really do it. It doesn't really make sense. But I sort of get what Kubo is going for. It's like Gremmy is kind of limited by himself, but if there's two of him, maybe they can come up with something even crazier to use to bring Zaraki down. What's crucial about this, though, is Zaraki is kind of unchaining the beast with Gremmy. That's the problem here, is that he's making Gremmy want to fight, want to win, and we see that Gremmy is unhinged. He's not someone who, like I said, understands really what it means to be in a fight, and so basically what you've got here is a character who wants to fight with the big boys. He wants to be up there with people like Zaraki, so he goes crazier and crazier as the fight goes on. He takes things further and further until he's taken them too far. And the Meteor is absolutely the definition of taking it too far, but wanting to prove that he is absolutely the best. And so, I kind of like this theme of Gremmy getting too big for his boots as the fight goes on, going further and further, being too far gone, wanting to stay one step ahead of Zaraki this whole time. Because you find out that Gremmy has just got this idea of Kenpachi being a monster in his head, and he needs to get over that somehow by constantly just upping the ante. And I think that's a neat way to structure a fight. I think that's honestly really cool. And this whole Meteor sequence is pretty crazy, to be honest. It surprises me that it only really lasts a single chapter. Now, a quick point on the art. Now, the artwork for this fight, generally speaking, is very good. But I will say that personally, this is just a personal opinion, I think the whole Meteor sequence looks vastly superior in colour. You just get that intensity a bit better. You get the ferocity of the Meteor. It looks like this big flaming ball in the sky. In black and white, because of there's a lack of texture to it a lot of the time. So it kind of just looks like a big white circle. And then when it crashes into the Shakon Maku, it's like a big white circle interacting with another big white circle. So I think it looks a lot better in colour, which is not necessarily something I can say all the time, but certainly here I think it does. Another small detail I really like is Bazby. You get reactions from everyone around, basically, and Bazby immediately knows it's Gremmy, which I think is nice, even if you kind of assume that maybe he's nowhere near that fight. I mean, I guess he could be, but I like the idea that Bazby just instantly is like, what is that idiot Gremmy doing? I think that's pretty cool. And Askin is just like, we should have kept him locked up, which it is also pretty dark, but on the whole, I think this is really neat. This whole sequence is very cool because it's not really like anything we've ever seen before. And what I mean by that is, and this is again that idea of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc making something feel like a much wider war, a much wider scope. There's a wonderful sequence of panic where both the Soldat and the Shinigami suddenly realise their inevitable doom as this meteor is going to destroy all of them. And they just stop fighting. They start running, trying to go for cover. They're pushing each other all out of the way, like, move, we're going to die, everyone get out of here. And I think that's so cool because it shows you that the war is meaningless at the end of the day beneath their total destruction. One side obviously wants to destroy the other, but if everyone there is going to be annihilated, all bets are off. And that's really cool. I think it's awesome. Again, that's such a cool visual, such a cool idea, and it makes it feel like a much bigger battle. I get a really good laugh as well out of Hashvolf basically telling those two Soldat to protect his majesty as if they can do anything about this situation. That makes me laugh. But there's a cool picture of Yhwach basically standing on one of the battlements, almost like egging this meteor on to try and destroy him if it can. That's really cool. But if we look at Gremmy's power briefly, it is obviously totally busted. Like, he can do basically anything. The only limit is his imagination. But it's like walking a constant tightrope. You know, you have to imagine he lives his life trying to not imagine anything that could be detrimental to him. There's a cool moment here where he's kind of gloating to Zaraki, but he says, let's say hypothetically, and I'm saying it hypothetically, I'm not imagining it, but let's say hypothetically that you killed me right now, this meteor would still be in existence. But I like that bit at the beginning there, because he has to be like, I'm not imagining it, this is just hypothetical. Because if he said, imagine you killed me right now, presumably he would just die. And so he has to live like that all the time. And that's pretty brutal. But it's interesting as well that Gremmy ends up so far gone at this point. He has become so obsessed with killing Zaraki that he's okay with basically nuking everybody and annihilating all of the Soul Society. But that just shows you what stage he's at in this fight now. It's interesting as well, though, I think maybe there's no love lost between him and his comrades, because he actually says, you know, I will be the only one left standing once this meteor hits and kills everybody, just as I imagined, which again it seems like he maybe wants to kill everyone. And when you think about him trapped in his cage beneath Silburn, it's not hard to see why. And actually a little bit later, Can't Fear Your Own World adds a bit more context to this, and you think that actually maybe this is what he wants after all, to be the only person left. And that's a little bit sad when you think about it, and again just makes me wish that Kubo had a chance to dive a bit deeper into characters like this. But of course, the big moment this whole fight has been building up towards, at the end of 2 chapters ago, Zaraki mentioned his Zanpakuto getting into it. At the end of the previous chapter, we got its name. He was like, I've never cut a meteor before. Isn't this exciting? Nozarashi. And finally, the moment is here. A moment certainly I never believed I would ever see. I just didn't think we'd ever get this, to be honest. But Zaraki flies towards the meteor. The sense of scale here is awesome. And he activates his Zanpakuto, Drink Nozarashi. It's a great moment. I love that Kubo, contrasts it with their initial flashback with him and Yachiru talking about their running theme of neither of them having a proper name. And it's like finally Zaraki has learnt the name that really means something to him, the name of his Zanpakuto. For so many years, he says that he understood, he had the pain of not having a name. And now he has a name to call his own, his Zanpakuto's name. And of course, Yachiru, there's a lovely shot of her looking up, watching him activate it for the first time. Of course, she is his Bankai Zanpakuto spirit, so this is a big moment for her as well. And this would, of course, kick off the subplot with her vanishing for the rest of the arc, essentially. But it's just a it's a really cool cathartic moment. And Zaraki, of course, destroys the meteor in a single swing, and you see Nozarashi for the first time. It is comically large at the end of this chapter. Like, Kubo definitely redesigns it ever so slightly. I think it's much better, a bit smaller, because it looks ridiculous here. But it's undeniably pretty cool, and it's just a very surreal moment to see Zaraki there, his massive blade on his back, and it's like, that is cool. That's the culmination of some really nice development in this arc, and it's just really cool to see. Chunks of the meteor just rain down on the town like hellfire. Again, this looks really cool in colour. And Gremmy is just like aghast at the fact that Zaraki seems to have defeated yet another of his upped antes. And he's like, you are a monster. Like, how am I supposed to defeat you? And again, it's this idea that Gremmy is kind of projecting himself onto Zaraki. But Zaraki, he's a simple man. He says, quieten down. It's pretty simple. As I said to you at the start, there's nothing I can't cut. And he's there with Nozarashi. Great picture of just this full body shot of him with his, frankly, really cool looking blade. I do really like it. I think it's awesome, and I think the payoff here is nice. The chapters here are also called The Undead, 5 and 6 I think it is, which is a nice callback to his initial fight with Ichigo, and I presume is a nice way of coming full circle back to the point where he didn't have a name. You know, he asked his Zanpakuto its name and it didn't reply, and now we're here at the end of that journey, and so that's really cool to see. But the fight isn't done. Gremmy multiplies himself numerous times now and decides to once again up the ante. What is greater than a meteor? Well, literally bringing the fabric of space into the battlefield. And all of these Gremmys just basically tear a hole in the canvas of the sky, trapping Zaraki in something called Galaxy Room, which is literally just outer space. You know, there's loads of stars. Visually, again, it's a really nice looking ability. Reasonably, is there any way Zaraki would survive this? Probably not. I mean, it is a manga about ghosts and the afterlife, so how much can you really apply logic like that? But Zaraki is pretty nastily affected by this. Kubo, again, going cool with his body horror here. You see his eye is like bubbling. Stuff is coming out of his mouth. I don't even really know what that's supposed to be. Maybe it's literally like his insides just bubbling and boiling, and basically he's really in a lot of pain here, but crucially, Gremmy has taken his eye off the ball. He's forgotten to harden his body, as he says that he had been doing for a while now, and Zaraki slices him in half. Again, there's a really nice visual. Presumably Gremmy was closing Galaxy Room around Zaraki, but Zaraki has managed to keep it from shutting, and he's got his sword poking out of the sky, which he then busts out of to return to the battlefield. His eyes, though, they're just covered in veins, they're all bloodshot. There's that awesome shot of him peering through the darkness. There's some really cool stuff going on in this fight from a visual standpoint. However, it's also not going to be that easy for Kenpachi, because when he slices Gremmy in half, Gremmy reveals that he's actually infused himself with a bomb. Loads of the other Gremmys then grab onto Kenpachi. They all detonate at once. There's a massive explosion. And Gremmy, now sweating, clearly this is taking a bit of a toll on him now, exerting himself to a pretty hefty degree, looks up and sees Zaraki is still alive. Not only is he still alive, he's still intact. Again, this cool, demonic appearance of him coming through the smoke. He's looking pretty injured now, but he's crucially okay. Covered in bruises, in burns, but, from someone like Gremmy's perspective, who, like I said, has never really been in a fight to the death before, this must be pretty scary. You've just pulled out the fabric of space, and Kenpachi is just leering at him through the dust, you can't kill me. And that's pretty crazy. It's not hard to see why Gremmy would start to freak out a little bit. And so we reach the end of the fight. Basically, Gremmy says that, if you're not going to die by anything I do, I will simply imagine myself to be stronger than you. And as he does this, his body morphs, it transforms, he grows grotesque, bulbous, massive muscles, and then his body ruptures. It just breaks apart and blood is shooting out of him, and he realizes that he has effectively killed himself. And Zaraki says, you imagine me to be a monster, and, there's no way your body can contain that, you idiot. And Gremmy just collapses to the ground. Now, it makes a lot of sense for Zaraki to call him an idiot. From his perspective, he was really starting to get into the fight. But Gremmy, as we've been saying, has been taking it further and further with each step, and this time he has finally crossed the line, crossed the point of no return, and basically destroyed his own body. But I'll be totally honest with you, I don't really like the end of this fight. It just sort of felt like Kubo didn't really know how to end things hastily because they needed to end, and so Gremmy just effectively just dies. It's like I get it, but I don't really like it. And I think now is a great time to talk about my single biggest problem with this battle being the pacing. I think the pacing of this fight is just completely out of whack. I think we needed maybe 2 more chapters, something like that. This entire battle has been leading up to the reveal of Kenpachi's Nozarashi, his Shikai, and of course we finally get that. But I think we needed maybe 2 extra chapters for this fight, because it's so weird to me that we go all that way to finally getting Nozarashi, and the moment the fight starts to get genuinely good, it's over in a flash. And that annoys me. We only get to see Nozarashi in this fight for 1 chapter, and that's just weird. That feels like the pacing was off to me. It feels like the fight really only gets going the moment it ends. That's my favourite part of the fight. Kenpachi being trapped in the galaxy room, Gremmy creating multiple clones of himself, Kenpachi cutting him in half, all of them revealing they have bombs, blowing up. That's when things really start to get going. And I kind of get it, because the fight up until that point, as we've talked about, has been Kenpachi tutoring this kid, teaching him what it means to be the strongest, but I think we, in many ways, kind of robbed of a real conclusion here, which is a bit of a shame. Now, Kenpachi would use Nozarashi later on in a later fight, but it's a shame that in the fight that was all about his Shikai, that was building up to that, we don't spend more time with it, we don't get to enjoy a more hectic battle. Gremmy just up and dies, and to me that is a little bit of a shame, and that's my biggest issue with this battle. I also have to say that while I have discussed already why Gremmy doesn't just kill Zaraki outright, I think that makes sense. What I don't think makes sense is Gremmy dying. I mean, how does that even work? You know, how does his imagination have a limit? We've seen he can literally create life, so the moment his body, which is a product of his imagination, was beginning to break down, why didn't he just create another one? It seems like his imagination does have limits, and again, it's this idea of trying to quantify the unquantifiable. It's weird, it's conceptual, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Why can't the brain, which is the core of Gremmy's entire being, just build another body? At the very end of this fight, you know, you see Gremmy collapsed on the floor, there's blood everywhere. But is it really any worse than when Zaraki was literally cutting him to pieces, shredding him to pieces? He was able to completely remove all of his wounds, so could he not just do that again? Is there some kind of metaphysical limit that we can't see, that his imagination reaches and then can't go any further? Is it simply that is he actually killing himself here for some reason? Has he kind of realized that, you know, he can't imagine a body strong enough to take on Zaraki, so he's just ending his life, maybe? It's always been a little bit weird to me. It does feel like Kubo needed to end the fight, so he just did. And I'm not entirely sure what you're supposed to take away from it. Is it because this is the body he's built for himself, and because it's ruptured that he has to die? But the brain is intact at the end of this fight. The container it's in is intact. And presumably, at least until whatever happens after the war, it's just sat there on the floor doing nothing. And Gremmy himself ceases to exist somehow. It is all pretty weird. And to be totally honest with you as well, I still to this day can't believe that Kubo ended a fight by revealing a brain in a jar and then having absolutely no explanation about it whatsoever. You kind of have to admire that in a weird way, but it's just so strange. Gremmy says that, I created this body myself, it's a product of my imagination. As he's disappearing, he's like, oh, I just imagined your power too perfectly, but I couldn't imagine a body strong enough to contain it. But now I'm imagining going to a place with no imagination. Oh, how lonely this must be. And then, he just disappears and all that's left is the brain. As I talk about it, as it's coming out of my mouth, I'm thinking of maybe new reasons for why he dies. And maybe if the brain is, because we go back to this idea of Gremmy being a part of the Soul King, if the brain is the Soul King's brain, maybe Gremmy is just a being totally divorced from it. Maybe Gremmy dying here is the same as Gwenael dying a little while ago. but then Gwenaël did seem to just be a figment of Gremmy, so I've really got no idea about how Gremmy dying, in quotation marks, even really makes sense. So let me know in the comments below, of course, what you think about Gremmy's whole death scene and how it works for you. If you've got any ideas, I'd absolutely love to hear them. But speaking of Can't Fear Your Own World, very briefly, there is a really nice moment of humanization with Gremmy, with Lil Toto of all characters, which really should have been in the manga. If this was something that Kubo was actually thinking about, this is the kind of humanization that many of the Sternritters absolutely needed in order for them to feel like real characters. We get Gremmy's kind of perspective on being locked up in this cage in a way that feels inhuman, and Lil Toto sort of takes pity on him. They share a nice moment together where he makes her food for her insatiable hunger. And, you get the sense that, Gremmy even seems to think that Yhwach Bark and the rest of the Sternritter are all quite selfish. And you get this sense of these two damaged individuals who have been maybe damaged by Yhwach Bark and the Shrift system, who are maybe all kind of missing something. Like Lil Toto has this unquenchable hunger, Gremmy has to be totally isolated because of his powers. They kind of come together in a really nice moment that I would have loved to have seen actually played out in the manga, because again, that could have given Gremmy some kind of depth outside of just this fight. But the fight does just kind of end, just a bit like that. Gremmy just sort of collapses onto the floor. Kenpachi doesn't really say anything at this point. He's just seemingly kind of accepted that the fight is over. He's highly injured. Gremmy's body just vanishes. It's a cool visual. You see Gremmy's like spine disappearing and stuff like that, but the fight ends, in my opinion, in a bit of an anticlimactic way, and I do think that is a shame, and that's why I don't really have an awful lot to say about the end of this battle. I think it is a bit disappointing the way it's handled. But the fight itself, I do think is very enjoyable, mostly because of the unique way it handles Kenpachi. Gremmy is an interesting character in that he's actually quite popular with the fan base, which I kind of understand. His power is pretty cool. I do like his design. But I just think he's such a weird character. Like I mentioned, he exists in a vacuum, and so for me, it's difficult to get truly attached to him. But I do like what Kubo did, I do like the visuals, and I think that this fight will be pretty amazing in the anime. But this has been quite a long battle analysis, so I really do hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for sticking with it till the end if you have. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the battle between Zaraki and Gremmy. How does it kind of stack up to the rest of his fights in the 1,000-Year Blood War? Because Zaraki does have quite a few of them. And what do you think about Gremmy as a character? That's someone we'll be able to explore a little bit deeper when we eventually come to do a character analysis video for him. But let me know, what do you think about the end of this fight as well? Maybe I'm off base and it's not disappointing, it's not anticlimactic, it's not too sudden. But I'd love to hear your thoughts and your theories about Gremmy's death, all that sort of thing. Do please let me know in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done, guys, and until next time, I'll catch you later. And I'll see you then.